Bike geometry can be very confusing. But what do all these different numbers and angles actually mean? And most importantly of all, how do they impact what your bike is actually like to ride? To find out more, I've come to Sturdy Cycles in Frome to speak to Tom Sturdy, the man responsible for creating these beautiful titanium bikes. Manufacturers spend hundreds, if not thousands of hours testing and refining even the smallest of changes to try to create the perfect balance between comfort, stability and control for all of their bikes. Geometry will vary between brands, different models and even different sizes to try to create a bike with the attended ride characteristics. However, geometry alone is just one piece of the puzzle. It needs to work together with the frame design, the materials and the tube shapes. So I want to speak to Tom to understand the hows and the whys and how he goes around designing a bike right from the very start. Before that, let's have a recap of the basics. Broadly speaking, cyclists have three main points of contact with the bike: your feet on the pedals, your bum on the saddle, and your hands on the handlebars. There are a number of different ways to adjust these, starting with the overall size of your frame and refined by making adjustments with the seat post, stem length, and handlebar height. While bike sizes in general are similar, a medium bike from one brand will be different to one from another, and some brands just use actual measurements like a 56cm frame. These typically refer to the seat tube length, but all measurements and angles of the frame will scale up or down with the size. The way in which manufacturers allow us to compare one frame to another is through geometry charts, which show the exact measurements and where they're taken from. But again, these vary from brand to brand, and in reality, a geometry chart is just a snapshot into what bike could fit you, rather than what it will actually feel like to ride. So, over to Tom to explain why.
The key thing to separate when you're looking at a geometry chart is what's going to affect like the size of the bike for a bike fit, in terms of what, how tall you are, what your reach needs to be, that sort of thing. But those numbers don't necessarily tell you the full picture of how the bike's going to perform in terms of the handling of it. So I think what's quite useful is to try and sort of separate those two things out a little bit, because a bike for one of the shorter riders who's going to buy a bike compared to a bike for one of the taller riders, the difference in their height is going to be pretty big, but the difference in the size of their bike actually will only be a few centimeters. So some of them are going to have a much bigger outcome than others. So certain things like the seat tube angle, that is arguably not going to have a huge direct impact on how the bike's going to feel to ride. And a lot of that's to do with, there are a few ways that you can adjust what that will do. So if you vary the seat tube angle on a bike design, what you're really doing is you're moving the rider backwards and forwards. But of course, at the end of the seat tube, you've got seat post, and that seat post can have different offsets. It can be an inline seat post, or it can have 10, 20, 25 mil.
So you've got some adjustability within the seat post.
Yeah, and then you've got the rails of the saddle as well. So simply changing the seat tube angle of a frame when you're designing the frame may or may not actually move where the rider's weight is, unless you're also designing it in conjunction with the use of a particular seat post. So, for example, if you're choosing a seat angle, you might want to run a steeper seat angle because it moves this angle forwards, which creates more space behind the tube for bigger tyres. So that's quite a common theme, especially now that bigger tyres are becoming more and more popular. If you want to make space for a bigger tyre, you've either got to move that forward or you've got to move the wheel back, which would mean lengthening the chainstay. And often steepening the seat angle is going to be a preferred approach, because you can do that and then use more offset at the seat post. So actually you can do it without changing where the rider needs to sit, because you can adjust that backwards at the top. I think the way to think about it is I like to try and separate into what are the dimensions that's going to control how the bike responds to an input, and that could be an input from the rider or an input from the environment, like bump on the road, a gust of wind, that sort of thing. So what's going to affect how the bike responds to that? And then the other side of that is what you feel through the vehicle is going to behave in a particular way, and then you get some feedback from that. One of the most influential dimensions on the whole bike is going to be the wheelbase of it, and that's because although we think about bikes as being sort of a static thing, because that's certainly when you're looking at a geometry chart, the impression is that it's a static thing. In reality, when you're riding a bike, it's an incredibly dynamic situation. Even when you're riding in what would be described as a steady state, so a road bike on a flat, level road, and you're riding straight along it, that's sort of described as steady state riding. But actually, in order to do that, you're balancing the bike, which means that effectively you're constantly falling over and making small adjustments to correct and stop you actually falling over. One of the ways to think about how the system's working is, because you're constantly balancing, it's a little bit like balancing an object on the tip of your finger. So for example, one of these two objects, you've got one object that's really long, one that's relatively small. If you were to balance one on the end of your finger, which one would you think is going to be easier to balance on the end of your finger?
Well, you see, I'm already guessing I could balance the ruler better because I've got more scope to try and counteract the movements.
Yeah, so that's exactly right. Like on one hand, this feels like it should be easier because it's a smaller object with a lower center of gravity. It's going to be closer to your finger. So you feel like I should be able to balance that one more easily than this one. But instinctively, you'd probably choose this one. And that's because it's easier for you to control. Yeah. Because it's less sensitive to the movement of your finger, which means that if you overcorrect or undercorrect, it's not going to fall straight off your finger, whereas this one would. And that is the same logic that applies to the bike. So how quickly does the bike change direction, which is kind of what's stopping you falling over. Yeah. And also how that interacts with you because you're part of the equation that's actually controlling it.
Road bike geometry has understandably evolved over time, but I feel like the evolution of it has been small refinements rather than big changes, because broadly speaking, most people are going to look at the shape of this and go, well, that's the shape of a bike. You know, we've got the double kind of diamond, the top tube's generally in a fairly similar place. But how has geometry evolved over time? And what are some of the ranges that we can see, for example, like common sizes?
Road bikes are like definitely the most mature type of bike if we're looking at the different genres of bike in particular. And yeah, like you say, road bike geometry doesn't change by a huge amount, and it's been fairly sort of settled for quite a long time. So yeah, you would expect the head tube angle of a road bike to be somewhere between 72 and 74 degrees is fairly common. On smaller sizes, it will go slacker down to sort of 71 and a half, 71. Okay. Yeah. But that's fairly common. And again, seat tube angle, you're going to see something between 72 and a half and 74 degrees it would be a really common range. Again, extreme size, you might see a little bit of a deviation from that. A bit, yeah. And basically, there's a set of numbers that works for how people want to ride road bikes, and there's probably there's like lots of layers of reasons as to why they've evolved. So you know, someone coming from a pure mountain bike background will almost certainly question what drop bars are for, and why road bikes have got such a short wheelbase, and why they run such a long stem so that you're holding the bars, you know, by mountain bike standards, like a million miles away from where you'd be used to. And a lot of those sort of nuances have evolved because road bikes have evolved, well, sort of came off velodrome and track, but it's racing in a tight pack. You don't want a really long bike.
Got to fit in a space.
You've got to fit in a space. You've got to be able to get through that space, and you've got to draft off someone who's in front of you. And what might be implicit to someone who's ridden in that situation, i.e. literally every centimetre that I can get closer to that person in front of me is a tangible benefit. So you want to have a front wheel, but you don't want the front wheel to be
really far
forward, because then you can't get close to the rider in front of you. So one of the ways that you can do that is to have these handlebars that allow you to ride in that position, but the front wheel isn't then forwards of that again. And that, there's kind of layers a bit like that of why certain trends have evolved on a road bike. And ultimately, just like I was saying, when to understand how the handling is going to work, you've kind of got to reference what you know. It's the same sort of thing, you know, that those things have evolved and they work. So the next iteration doesn't need to be a million miles away from that. It could be,
Yeah.
and it might be better in some ways. And there could be a really strong argument for having a road bike that does have a really long wheelbase because it'd be stable at speed, but then it might be rubbish at riding in a fast group ride.
Yeah, speaking about the position of the front wheel, it feels like a really crucial thing to get right. And I think something that a lot of people perhaps wouldn't realise is that there's a difference between that head tube angle of a bike, which is obviously matched with the steerer because it runs through the middle of it. But then also you've got this variation here of the angle that the lower section of the fork then follows.
Yeah.
And something that I find confusing is understanding the relationship between things like how we eradicate like toe overlap or discuss the trail and where the different angles and rakes of the fork. How does this all link together? And give me some kind of understanding and explainer of the differences between the terms that people often see.
Yeah, so the steering geometry is a really important part of bike design.
Yeah.
And I think probably the dimension that most people are going to reference is the head tube angle.
Yeah.
So that's literally this angle here of this tube.
Which is how the forks would sit through.
Yeah, so the angle of the steerer tube.
Yeah.
Because that's the dimension that's nearly always going to be published on a bike. And of course that is a really powerful dimension, because a very small change in this angle, if you're projecting that all the way down to the hub and then where the actual tire is going to touch the ground, a very small change will make a big difference down here. So when you adjust the head angle, you're adjusting the angle and the wheelbase, which we've sort of mentioned. The other really important aspect of the steering geometry, though, is that you have an offset on the fork, or a rake.
Okay. So that's the reason the fork doesn't just continue in a straight line.
Yeah, so where the actual axle is, or where the hub is not directly in line with the steering axis of the bike. So there's an offset, which is either called offset or rake. Or if you're not talking about bikes, it might be called caster. So the reason that exists is it creates a dimension which is called trail, which basically means that if you project the angle of the steerer tube until it is touching the ground, that will, where that kind of invisible line is touching the ground, is ahead of where the tire is physically touching the ground.
Okay.
So like a shopping trolley wheel, where the point of rotation is ahead of where the tire is touching the ground, and when you push your shopping trolley, you expect the wheel to follow the direction that the thing is traveling in, and that's what it does. So that dimension creates that stability in this rotation, which means that whatever direction the bike is going in, the front wheel will follow that. So that is in conjunction with the wheelbase of the bike. So basically you've got, when the bike moves or changes direction, the wheel is going to follow that. So it gives that whole setup some inherent stability. If you didn't have it, then the rider, or whoever whatever is on the other end of this axis, so you as a rider, are going to be, you don't have anything helping you to make the wheel follow the direction the bike's going in. So it's a really, really important dimension that controls the way the bike is going to respond to an input. There are other factors that will affect the stability. So for example, when you've got a rotating mass, you get the centripetal acceleration of that wheel, and the gyroscopic effect of that adds stability. But essentially, that's going to be like a constant for the bikes that people are looking at. So the things that change that are going to affect that are predominantly wheelbase, the trail that is created by a combination of the head tube angle and the offset of the fork, and then some other things like the bottom bracket height, which is kind of like how high above that footprint of the bike you are.
So is that drawing a straight line from the axles, essentially?
Yeah, so if we imagine this fork being in here and drew a line between the axles, the center of the bottom bracket wouldn't be on that line.
Why does it always sit lower?
By adjusting the bottom bracket height, what you're really doing is shifting the rider up and down over the wheelbase.
Okay.
Which is affecting where the center of mass is, because really the center of mass is largely tied to where the rider is, because they're the largest mass on the on the bike. It's another area though where there are other things to consider, because you could raise the center of mass by raising the bottom bracket. And that might be useful for some things. If you imagine balancing that on the end of your finger, there's a point where having a higher center of gravity is easier. And if you imagine riding through a sandpit in a cyclocross race, you don't sit on the saddle, you get up out the saddle and you want to let the bike move. So you kind of want to isolate your center of mass from the footprint, because the footprint's going to be completely out of your control. And if you're tied to it, then you're just going to come off. So there are certain situations where a high bottom bracket might be beneficial, but you can imagine that if you make this too high, you literally won't be able to get on the bike, because the top tube will have to be higher.
Well, you're back to your constraints of like not a product, but the fact of the size of a person.
Yeah, exactly.
You can't even climbing up over the thing.
With all of these, there's always that kind of, you don't ever really have like free reign over absolutely everything. You're always working within those constraints. Road bikes in particular have iterated towards, pretty similar solution. Most people are using on the face of it, a very similar set of numbers. A lot of that is tied to, actually the kind of use case of road bikes is also pretty straightforward. Roads are roads, and they haven't really changed for a long time, whereas other genres of how people are riding the bikes is evolving much quicker. And so yes, it does definitely tend to approach a set of numbers that works, but it's not really, whilst you can do it to a certain extent, it's not really fair to say that you can isolate geometry completely from the rest of the bike design in terms of the structure of it, what material you're making it out of, how you're physically manufacturing it. And all of those considerations are going to have an effect on ultimately how the bike will feel. And so geometry does tie into that. Now, I've designed lots and manufactured lots of bikes over the time that I've been doing it, and used lots of different materials to do that. And there are definitely trends that I would choose for a particular material versus another material. And a lot of that is tied to my understanding of some of the kind of smaller, they can be potentially difficult to quantify. You get lots of people talking about how steel bikes feel to ride and how titanium bikes feel to ride. And it's not true to say that all carbon bikes are definitely going to be a particular way, but the material does behave in a particular way, and you can accommodate that, or you can design a geometry that's going to complement that. And so I would definitely bias a geometry design one way or the other, depending on how and what I'm making the bike from. I'm lucky enough to be in a fairly unique position where, I am the person designing, manufacturing, and then, we ride these bikes, we maintain these bikes every day. So all of those things are kind of within my immediate grasp, and they do all fold into how I would design a bike. So yes, it's definitely true that I would subtly alter the geometry of a design if I was making it in this way versus if I was using a different material like steel or designing a composite bike. So you've kind of there's always another layer of considerations that are going to influence a decision that you might make about a geometry. That's a lot easier for me to do because I'm in direct control of all of those things. Yeah, you're one person, whereas I guess if you look at something on a mass scale, think a massive global bike brand, you've obviously got presumably a department or a person going, this is the geometry one. Then you've got another department going, well, this is how we're going to make it. And they've got to kind of work together because, well, you tell me, but I guess you could have a really good geometry that really didn't work because of the design of a frame or the materials, or you could have a really beautifully made bike and shapes and construction, but you could have bad geometry. And either way, unless they work together, you're going to have what I assume would be a bad bike to ride. Yeah, that's definitely true. I think probably to put that in context is it wouldn't be a bike that is impossible to ride. Like it'd be very hard for someone to make a bike that was unrideable completely. But of course, like the sort of the subtleties that we're talking about, it's definitely possible to have a sort of scenario where the geometry and the material or the way that the bike's manufactured perhaps don't complement each other very well. The problem with that is that it's very difficult to quantify that stuff. A lot of it is going to be quite subjective, and it might not work for one rider, but it might be okay, or it might be fine for another rider. So that's definitely, it's a really challenging thing to sort of be firm about, but it's definitely there and it's definitely tangible. So, you know, that we put a lot of thought into trying to avoid that situation. And like I say, that's kind of probably a bit easier for me than it is for a much bigger company where the design and the manufacturer are much more separate.
So I guess this leads me on to the fact that you can create a custom geometry within the realms of the constraints of what we've discussed. You could essentially do whatever you decide works for this type of rider, this size of bike. But obviously manufacturers have spent years trying to hone a certain model of bike and go, that's categorized what that bike feels like and defines it to ride. People go, okay, this certain bike, we all know that that's how it rides because this brand has spent the last 10 years making it and refined it along the way. But are there any examples you think of when somebody would perhaps really benefit from having a bike designed specifically to them? And my assumption would be perhaps it's at the extreme ends of the scale of sizes.
Yeah, so I think that's definitely the most obvious application. You know, someone who is particularly tall or particularly small, there may not be a bike that is kind of a standard size that works for them, and so they might be like forced to go and get someone to custom make them something. And that's definitely the most obvious application. We have a lot of customers who are not, you know, who are in that kind of category, but a lot who aren't. And I think for those who aren't, the benefit are in those subtleties that we talked about. And a lot of that comes down to perhaps something as simple as me discussing or getting some information from the customer as to what they like about cycling and trying to translate that into, you know, experiences they've had before on a bike where, I don't know, they got terrified on a descent riding a particular bike because the handling was completely wrong. And it's definitely possible to then kind of look at that geometry, try and understand what it was about that geometry that didn't work for them, and then address that in a new thing. And often those changes can be quite small, but the impact for the rider can be quite big.
But one area that is rapidly evolving, and I think perhaps pushing the boundaries of what's possible with design and geometry, is the world of gravel bikes. And I'm assuming this is because of consumers and I guess an industry desire to try to keep squeezing the fattest tires possible into the frame.
Yeah.
So what constraints does that put on design, and how on earth do you try to magic up extra space to fit a tire in?
With gravel bikes, the tire size is pretty much the challenge, and there's the constant push at the moment is for bigger and bigger tires, and that does have like an immediate kind of knock on in terms of the bike design. And I think we've probably seen that in the wider industry with gravel bikes. Sort of new generations of gravel bikes have been outdated really quickly simply because they don't have enough clearance for riders' tire preference. And it has a massive impact because it's such a fixed thing in terms of the tire has to have space around it. And also the thing that you adjust in order to create space for that tire is a really important dimension, because primarily, if you want to fit a big tire in, the bike's going to have to get longer because you have to have space for the tire to not hit the tubes. There are adjustments that you can make. So we talked about like steeper seat angles that are then offset backwards at the top so that you don't affect the rider position too much. There comes a point though where sort of you can only do those things so much, because for example, you got the chain line of the bike, where the chain is on the chain ring. So 1x chain rings have helped that a lot, because you lose a chain ring that is further in.
Yeah.
But even with those, you know, if you have the chain stays too short, then the widest point of the tire is very close to where the chain ring needs to be. So then you have the option you need to move the chain line out to move the chain out to make bigger tires. So then that suddenly starts to affect not frame design but componentry design. And you know, it's happened on mountain bikes, and mountain bikes have gone through different hub spacing standards in order to solve that problem. So hubs have got wider and wider and wider as they've moved chain lines wider and wider and wider to accommodate wider tires.
So I guess a good way to kind of summarize and wrap this up would be, how do you envisage geometry evolving in the future? And what do you think could be the driving factors behind it, or perhaps the limiting factors to stop it evolving, really?
Yeah, so I think the things that force geometry to change are the things that we sort of discussed right at the beginning, like, so if I were going to need to design a bike to accommodate really big tires, and there's another conversation as to why the customer might want those really big tires, but that is a thing that is going to force me to change the geometry of the bike. And so I think, and we've probably even started to see that subtly on road bikes. I haven't actually looked at the numbers, but just off the top of my head, as road bike tires, or as the size of tires on road bike has just generally crept up, you've probably seen a subtle change in some of the angles that we talked about, like head angles. I'd say probably slightly slacker head angles are now more common on road bikes. I think with certain things, road bikes in particular, there's a reason that it has been so stable for so long, and that is that it is a solution that works for what is now a fairly well-established form of cycling.
It seems mad to think that you think one of the biggest driving factors is going to be the tyres. Like, something that seems like such a simple thing on the face of it. It's like, wow, it's just bigger tyres. And then you're like, well, you've just skewed all this geometry off.
Yeah, it's a really big influence. And I think probably what you might, though, end up getting to a point where things become cyclical, because bigger tyres are good for a huge number of things, but they do fundamentally change how the bike behaves. They force a physical change in the dimensions that we've talked about, but then there's all of the softer stuff, like they literally feel different to ride. And actually, we talked about trail, but a big tire, so there's also a dimension called pneumatic trail, which is a similar dimension, but related to the size of the tire, basically. And then you've got a big tire, lower pressure, the pneumatic trail changes significantly. And ultimately, it does feel different to ride. And so there may well come a point where, whilst the bigger tires are better in some way, they detract from a certain feeling that you get when you're riding. That means that people actually don't want to go any bigger, and then maybe that's where the kind of geometry ends up settling, because you don't need to start accommodating ever bigger tires.
Yeah, fair. Well, I mean, it's not the answer I ever thought I was going to come away with talking about bike geometry, that tires have really been the biggest nightmare to sort out. And I guess, like a lot of things, really, I suppose we're probably going to see the limitations pushed until people kind of feel like they've reached that goal, and then maybe we'll see it come back down again. I think tires are going to get wider and wider, and then everyone's going to go, right, this really ruined every bike geometry, so let's dial it back a little bit.
Yeah, I think so. Based on my own personal experience, that I'm talking about tires specifically, I've used relatively big tires on road bikes for a long time now, but also I haven't gone bigger and bigger and bigger, because personally, the type of riding I do, there's a point at which I feel like I lose some of the feeling that I get from a road bike when the tires go over a certain size. So personally, I don't use over a certain size, and I think I wouldn't be surprised if other riders come to that conclusion as well.
So over the time of bikes evolving, if we go back a number of years, you would have a bike brand would just make the frame. And we've gradually seen that evolve over time to the brands now making their own forks, their own components and accessories. So why do you think we've started to see a lot of this stuff being taken in-house rather than buying separate components from different places?
Having control over as many of those kind of critical dimensions as possible, ultimately that's what allows you to create a bigger end sort of change for the end user. So, if you're only making a frame, then you can only change the certain geometry aspects, and Of course, the customer might be able to spec a particular fork or that will affect the trail. But if you've got control over all of those things, and the change that you might make to each one of those areas might only be small, but I think it's a case of the end result being sort of greater than the sum of its parts. That's certainly the approach that I take here, is that by being able to control those things, you can really have as much influence as possible over what the final product will be like for the end user to use.
Over the years, we've seen different extreme designs and iterations of bikes. I mean, the first thing that comes to mind for me is perhaps like the giant TCR, this like crazy compact design where I think visually most people would be able to go, hey, this bike is a totally different design. But can you think of any other examples where brands have maybe pushed the limitations, or even like why do you think that was the case?
Yeah, well, I think that's a really good example because, well, it's one that I remember very clearly, and it is just such an obvious visual departure from what was the norm. And in that specific case, a lot of it was driven by like manufacturing methodology. Bikes were going through an evolution of having been made effectively tube to tube, where you have a length of tube in any material, whether it was carbon or metal, whether that be steel or aluminium, and effectively they're cut and joined to the next tube. And at that time, everything was shifting towards more monocoque construction, where they were using bigger molds to make larger sections of the frame. And so it was a really obvious visual departure from what had been the norm. I think that also is a good example of some of the limitations, because when they were first released, you went from having bike sizes or bikes available in sizes that were sort of 10 millimeter increments in top tube length. So you might have 5 or 6 sizes for a model. Again, I might be wrong, but I'm pretty sure those Giants only came in 3 sizes.
Whoa, yeah.
Certainly for a while. And that's because it was made in a different way. It had this whacking great mold that was needed to make it that was really costly. So they didn't want to make 10 of them. They just made 3 of them, for example. So it's a good, it was a big departure on one hand, but that came with some consequences in terms of how many sizes the thing were available for. And for a number of years after that, you did see manufacturers tending to have fewer frame sizes. And then they were made to fit riders by adjusting the contact points, like stems and seat posts and that sort of thing.
I think you do see that through different brands, don't you? Some tend to have a fairly limited range of sizes, and others you've got smaller increments which take it back to maybe what times would have been like in the past. So there you go. That is a lot of chat about bike geometry. And while I knew it was a confusing and detailed subject, I've actually learned a lot of stuff here speaking to Tom, and I hope you found it really informative and helpful too. Please do get involved in the comments section down below if you did enjoy this video, and also if you have any other questions about bike geometry, because I'm quite happy to ask Tom or answer them in a future video. And as always, if you want to support our channel and see more interesting and cool videos all about bike tech, well then subscribe to GCNTech and turn on your notifications. Right, I'm out of here. See ya.